Hello everyone, Professor Krizluk here. So today we're going to explore the connection between protest movements, electoral institutions, and think about voter behavior. These pieces of American politics are oftentimes studied separately, but in reality are pretty tightly woven. And from our reading this week, we see how they can help us make sense of electoral politics. So the readings for this week kind of gave us a roadmap for where our discussion will go today. So we read pieces of The Loud Minority by Daniel Gillens. We see how protest movements matter for electoral politics, especially through their impact on party conventions and how that shapes party platforms and what parties are going to argue that they stand for during a general elections. From Atchin and Bartel's Democracy for Realists, we read chapter 3 and chapter 4, and we see two important critiques about voters, about electoral politics. First, how reforms to expand direct democracy have oftentimes failed to live up to the promises. Takes a pretty critical view of direct democracy. And second, how voters really make choices at the ballot box, oftentimes through something called retrospective judgments rather than informed policy decisions. So these are just two readings, 3 chapters, 2 readings that again are just laying another layer to our foundation of understanding how voters make decisions, how electoral politics works. And when we put these readings for this week together, these works help us think critically about how electoral politics really works, which is what we've been working on and what we'll continue to work on throughout the semester, thinking about how voters really make decisions, how electoral politics really works. Okay, so let's start. We'll just go through chronologically of what we read for this week and then how we talked about it on Wednesday and Monday, then Wednesday. So we'll begin with our discussion about protests. At first glance, protest looks like something outside of electoral politics. Contentious politics is oftentimes viewed as outside the institutional framework of politics. But protests take place on the streets. Elections take place at the ballot box. But Gillen argues that these two spheres are actually deeply connected with one another. Protests, he shows, deliberately use party conventions as opportunities to push issues into electoral debates. So party conventions, we watched some videos about the 1968 protests at the Democratic National Committee convention. So we have a visual of what these protests look like. Most protests aren't that intense, aren't that, I don't want to say extreme, but that forceful. So we talked about how there are protests even today at conventions. So conventions themselves are moments when parties are highly visible, when platforms are being drafted, and when candidates are seeking to present themselves to a national audience. That visibility makes them kind of targets for activism. When we think about the conventions that we just lived through, we saw Hulk Hogan at the RNC, and we saw celebrities at the DNC, and there was discussions that who might actually perform at the DNC. So these conventions are places where the party comes together and really tries to unify, oftentimes after a pretty hard-fought primary season. So conventions today, we've seen them on TV. Even if you didn't sit down and watch a convention, you probably saw clips. You probably saw the Hulk Hogan clip where he's tearing his shirt off, or you saw those celebrities at the DNC. So conventions today serve this purpose. But they also serve these as locations where our author argues that people can protest. A classic example is the '64 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, where we saw protests. Another probably maybe is captured more in video is the one we looked at in class of the 1968 DNC in Chicago. So we see these protests, and then when we think of these conventions, they're designed to unify the party, get a platform out there. But people protest them, demonstrators protest them because protests want to shape those agendas, the agendas of electoral politics. Issues that can start out in the streets end up being talked about on the convention floor and later in campaign debates. Protesters don't just shout from the sidelines, they reshape the menu of choices that parties and therefore voters must consider. So our author argues that, okay, these aren't just meaningless protests that occur out on the streets. They actually can, designed, and the idea by the protesters is that they can shape the platform in a way that maybe these voices wouldn't have been able to shape if they were demonstrating somewhere else. So they come to the convention, they protest at the convention. So let's change gears. Let's shelve that for a minute, and let's connect that to Archon and Bartel's critique of reforms meant to expand direct democracy. So on one hand, we have what demonstrators are doing on the street, trying to shape conventions. And then let's think about direct democracy itself. Again, maybe it seems like these are completely different ideas, but we're building a picture of how electoral politics works. So we read chapter 3 and chapter 4. Chapter 3 in Democracy for Realists, the authors review the history of efforts to make democracy more direct. So more power to people. So if one of our readings is saying, okay, people are using their voice and their power to shape politics, to shape party platforms, Bartel was making that argument. Our authors in Democracy for Realists are saying, okay, what happens if we actually have a little bit more direct democracy? Our authors review the history of efforts to make democracy more direct, things like primary elections, ballot initiatives, and referenda. So reformers believe that bypassing those party elites and giving citizens more control, the system would become fairer and more responsive to voters. So, let's see. The authors look at ballot initiatives, which sound pretty democratic in theory. But the authors argue that in practice they often reflect the preferences of well-funded groups who can pay to gather signatures and run campaigns. California, the authors argue, offers the clearest example, where initiatives there have often been driven by billionaire donors rather than grassroots movements. So the authors argue that the bigger lesson is that more democracy doesn't necessarily mean better democracy. Sometimes reforms meant to empower the people simply empower different elites, or make the system more chaotic and, they argue, less representative. And so here is where protest ties in again. If electoral institutions do not reliably translate citizens' narrow groups, or empower narrow groups, or because initiatives are captured by big money, then contentious politics becomes another way. Protests can bypass the weaknesses of institutions and force attention to issues that voters might never see fully represented through formal channels. So there, if we put our pieces together, we can see how they work together they work together through electoral politics. So chapter 4 was about retrospective voting, something that maybe if we have never heard that word, we understand this idea. So let's shift our attention to the voters themselves. So in chapter 4, Archin and Bartel tackle the central question: how do ordinary citizens decide whom to vote for? The traditional ideal, sometimes called the folk theory of democracy, which we talked about in a previous week, is that voters carefully study the issues, weigh party platforms, and then choose the candidate that best reflects their policy preferences. That's really the civics textbook version of democracy that we've all learned about in introductory U.S. government textbooks. But the authors argue that decades of research suggest otherwise. Instead of being forward-looking policy choosers, most voters are retrospective. They look back at recent past and ask, am I better off than I was before? And if the answer is yes, then they reward the incumbents. If no, then they punish them. So in this view, the authors argue that voters oftentimes slip into what the authors call blind retrospection. Voters don't punish leaders for bad policies, they sometimes punish them for bad luck. If a global phenomenon occurs that's outside of the purview of a president, outside the control of a president, well, then voters will punish that president. They will punish those elected, even if it's just bad luck. So the authors bring up studies show that voters punished Woodrow Wilson's Democrats after a series of shark attacks off the New Jersey shore in 1916. An event that obviously had nothing to do with governmental policy, but voters in farming regions punished incumbents after droughts and floods. Again, something out of their control. Governors and presidents have been punished for global recessions or spikes in oil prices, truly outside of their control. This means that retrospective voting, the authors argue, is a very blunt instrument. It provides some accountability, but it's noisy, biased, and oftentimes unfair. When we think about recent elections, the COVID-19 pandemic devastated the economy in 2020. Many voters blamed Donald Trump for the economic downturn, even though much of it was beyond his administration's control. At the same time, some voters rewarded governors or mayors for effective pandemic responses. Retrospective judgments mattered, but they were uneven and often driven by perceptions rather than policy details. So, what happens when we put this all together? Protests shape the electoral agenda by pushing issues into party platforms and conventions. Institutional reforms like primaries and initiatives meant to empower voters often, and sometimes if not often, produce unintended consequences, empowering activists or moneyed interests instead. Voters themselves rely heavily on retrospective judgments, which can provide some accountability but are distorted by luck, misinformation, and of course partisanship. The big picture is that electoral politics is far more complex and at times more limited than the idealized theory of democracy that we think about in maybe an introductory course. Elections matter, but they don't work in isolation. They are influenced by movements, by institutions, and by cognitive shortcuts of voters.